Hey, you can be seated. I really thought that our 9:30 experience was going to be slim today, but they piled in here, and they rolled up in here. So they said no hour of sleep gonna hold them down, and so we welcome you 11:15 and welcome you watching online. You are part of our extended family, and so you watch literally all around the state and even the U.S. and people from other countries even joining us. So, how many of you guys hungry? You're going to be hungry by the time we leave today. And y'all already raising your hands, like hurry up and get done with this message already. So last week we made a shift in our conversation. We started a series a few weeks back called Crazy Love, and we talked about relationships and friendships and family and dating and marriage and all that. And then we shifted last week, started talking about loving our neighbor as ourself. And so we began the conversation when talking about generosity. And I see you came back, so I'm glad you did. So many people, I think, are challenged by this season. I've had people literally tell me, hey, we're giving our stimulus checks, we give our tax returns to be a part. It's a great opportunity for them to be generous at the middle of the year. And so we are so grateful because the things that I'm going to talk to you about in the coming weeks cannot happen without the generosity of people who call Relevant Church their home. And so today we're going to shift and have another conversation. And we're going to read Mark chapter 12, beginning in verse 28. This is our verses that we're talking about in this series. It says this, a teacher of the law, a religious man, came to Jesus and he asked Jesus these questions: of all the commandments, which is the most important? Now he says one, right? He says, tell me which one is the most important. Well, Jesus says this, the most important one, answered Jesus, is this: Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God. He's quoting the Old Testament. The Lord is one. And he says, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. That should be enough, right? He asked for one. He gave him one. That's the end of the discussion. You ever ask somebody one question and they gave you 9 answers? Yeah. And you ask your kid, what do you want for Christmas? And they tell you everything. So at the end of this conversation, he asked for one. Jesus gives him one. But before the man can respond, Jesus says the second is this. He said, I didn't ask for one, but one. He said, but I got 2. Love your neighbor as yourself. There is no commandment greater than these. In other words, there is something about loving God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and loving your neighbor as yourself that are inseparable. Now, you ever met people you just don't like? I mean, no point, but you just don't like them, so you're saying, Carl, you telling me I need to love them? And I'm saying to you that when God changes your life and you and I recognize the love of God towards us, there should be an overflow of God's love in us, through us, and out of us to those around us. And so a few years back, maybe you're new to Relevant Church. We're going to take a walk down memory lane here in a little bit. But I want to give you a little history, a little background, a little kind of the foundational conversation of who Relevant Church is. We have about 30 people in First Step today. They're hearing all about some of the things I'm talking about right now. But about 3 years ago, we sat over in the kids' auditorium area. And this before this building obviously broke ground. And we started talking about what is it we're facing in a community. And we started talking about the brokenness and the hurt and the pain and how so many people keep it all together on Instagram, or maybe their yard, you pull up at their house and everything looks great, but behind all those closed doors, there's a lot of dysfunction. Behind all the filters, behind all the masks, behind all of the facade, there is a crisis of brokenness. And here's the reality. You and I have all been through that season. We all are broken in some capacity. We all have some brokenness in our life that we need to deal with. We're on this journey toward our full potential, but we realize that we're not just talking about small little issues to deal with. Our world and our country is as broken and as dysfunctional as it's ever been. And so we termed this idea of the crisis of brokenness, and how are we going to address the crisis of brokenness? And so we started to identify some areas that we felt like contributed to the brokenness in our culture, and specifically in this community and around this area. And we coined this phrase, for the love. Now, let me break down what for the love means if you're new to Relevant Church. It's just an acrostic, and each letter stands for a different word, and I want to kind of unpack it, so we'll throw this graphic on the screen. The L in love means for the love of the lonely. Do you know how many orphans and widows there are that are lonely and isolated and feel separated from relationships that God intended? Do you know how many people are divorced and living alone? Do you know how many people who feel like they've lost someone? They are seriously isolated and lonely. And now, in the middle of what we went through in the last year, we've seen loneliness rise to a level that's caused more anxiety, more fear, more suicidal thoughts than ever before. And the O stands for the overwhelmed. How many single moms you know? You think single moms aren't overwhelmed in this season? How many people do you know that are overwhelmed by the current circumstances of life, by sickness, by disease, by something that's happened to them, by the crisis that they're in? They're overwhelmed because they don't know how to make ends meet financially. They don't know how to keep all the pie spinning. They don't know how to care for the kids. They don't know how to care for the parents. They're just overwhelmed with life's circumstances. Then we talked about the vulnerable. These are the people who are at risk. We know in this season, a lot of the vulnerable have been the elderly through this pandemic, but there are more people that we haven't talked about in quite some time because of the nature of everything. What about foster care? What about the children who are abandoned? They're vulnerable, right? And then they end up on the streets, or they end up in sex trafficking and human trafficking. We talked about years ago how we would partner, and we're going to be doing that here in the next couple weeks with Gigi's House, making a difference in girls and boys being rescued out of human trafficking. Kids that are running away, they're very vulnerable because they come from single-parent homes or fatherless homes. These are the people, these are the kids, these are the issues that our community is facing. And then we talked about the empty. These are just people who don't even know why they're struggling, what's happened. Maybe something happened to them as a child, or they've been through some major trauma or dysfunction. Maybe you are in that season or have been in that season of life, and you're just devoid of maybe purpose or meaning. And so we said we are going to go after people with this idea of for the love. And I'm going to talk more about that in the weeks to come. And so if you go to our first step conversation and course that we started today, or every month actually starts the first step, next step, heart and soul. You'll hear in first step our values. You'll hear next step our values. You'll hear in our ministries our values at Relevant Church. And one of our values is we take just the word relevant and break down what we stand for, what we believe, and what we value, and how we're going to live out our calling as a church. And one of those values is everyone always. And what we say is we don't just exist for a group of people. We don't exist to be a country club or a clique or some small community. We exist for everyone so that people can find hope. And the way we coined it is this in our mission statement: so that we exist so that people far from God can reach their full potential in Jesus Christ. In other words, no matter what people are going through, no matter what they're facing, whether they're far from God, not acknowledging that God exists, we're not just talking about somebody coming to their faith and saying, okay, I believe God is who He says He is. We're talking about coming along broken people who are far from God, them moving from death to life in Christ, and now going on a journey to help them live out their greatest calling and their greatest potential in Christ. We don't just exist to build buildings or gather and eat potlucks. Y'all grew up in those churches where you brought the macaroni and cheese every time. We don't do this to sit back and do church and gather to say we do something so we can feel good. We say we want to reach people no one else is reaching, and so we're going to have to do things no one else is doing. Now let that sink in. A lot of people doing a lot of things, aren't they? There's a lot of causes out there. There's a lot of 501c3s and GoFundMes for everything. We have to say, okay, we aren't going to just try to be some cool, hip church that gathers a crowd. We're not going to be a cut and paste church that just copies everything every other church does. We're not here to do what everyone else is doing. We're trying to look at our community in this crisis of brokenness and say, what does it take? What does it require of us? And that's why recently you've seen the launch of something that was about a year and a half ago. We got together in 2019 and started talking about a wholeness and wellness center. And we said, we want to see either on this property, in this vicinity, a wellness center and a wholeness center that says, we're going to take people who far from God, they come to know Christ, or maybe they haven't even come to know Christ, and we're going to help them with counseling and their physical health and their nutrition, and we're going to help them with financial counseling, and we're going to help them with their marriage and all the different, just to help people get whole and well. And so we launched a counseling center as the beginning stages of that, and you guys were so generous to be a part of that. This stuff, listen to me, is messy. It's hard. It's a whole lot easier to gather a crowd. I love crowds. I love the hype. I love the energy. It's a whole lot easier to bring the hype and then go home and forget about it, isn't it? It's a whole lot harder to dig into the dysfunction that you and I face. And so we launched something this year called The Good Life. So excited about what that's doing, helping people come to know Christ. And we say, we are not going to stop until we've made the gospel available and communicated it in terms where our community and everybody who has the opportunity to hear gets that opportunity to hear. Why is that important? You've heard me say this. If you've been a part of Relevant Church for years, you've heard me say it over and over and over. Every number has a name. Every name has a story. And every story matters to God. And so I get text messages all the time when I say this, and they'll say, you know what? I was a number, but finally I realized I found my identity in Christ, that I was more than a number sitting in a crowd, but that Jesus, that God the Father loved me for who I am, and He had a plan and a purpose for my life, and that I matter to God. And that's the journey toward people reaching their full potential. And so We say, we will do everything short of sin to reach those far from God. Now, let me make a turn here. That's a little bit about who we are and why we do what we do. And for those of you who are new to Relevant Church, you may have just come into this building or tuned in online or never really understand where we've come from. Here's what I know. We've had a lot of exciting times in our past. We've had a lot of moments where I can look back, and every time we go down this journey together, I get excited, I get emotional, I get all of those things. We had a lot of mountaintop experiences. Things where you'd look out and say, man, can we just sit here and enjoy the view, right? You've been in the mountains and you just sit and you just look out at the sunset and you say, man, this is beautiful. If I could just stay right here, this is where I want to be. And so there's this passage in the New Testament where Jesus goes up on a mountain, and you see this passage, you see this pattern all throughout Jesus' ministry and even out throughout the Old Testament where the people of God would meet with God on mountaintops. So Jesus takes Peter, James, and John up on a mountain, and this moment in history known as the Transfiguration, where this bright light shone from heaven, and all of a sudden the disciples saw that Jesus not just as this man, but actually saw that he was the Son of God. They recognized something that they had never noticed about God. That, okay, this is the Son of God. And Peter makes this comment. He says, Jesus, this is amazing. I'm paraphrasing. Can we just pitch some tents and live up here now? In other words, this moment with God, this moment on this mountaintop that we celebrate is so good, we don't want to leave. We don't want to leave. Some of you look forward to tuning in or joining on Sundays because this is your moment where you feel like, man, this is my mountaintop experience. And we don't want to leave because Monday's coming, right? But Jesus says, we can't stay here. And they go down the mountain. And immediately when they go down the mountain, they see a boy with seizures. And Jesus heals this man with seizures. And here's what I need you to understand about mountains. Mountaintops can become monuments if we allow them to. Now, I'm gonna go down a road and you'll see what I'm talking about. But it's easy to always look back and say, remember that time we were on the mountain with Jesus? You remember that time when God did this? Remember that moment? Remember this? Remember that? And if we're not careful, mountaintops will become monuments, and we'll solidify them, and we'll make statues, and we'll celebrate the past rather than looking forward to the future. And too many churches, you know this, they started out on the right track. They started out on mission, on point. And then somewhere 50, 60 years down the road, 20 years down the road, they lost credibility. They lost relevance. They lost speaking the word of God and challenging people who are far from God that they can experience something greater in their life. And so they've become old buildings just sitting there with older people. Hear me, if you're over 40, I qualify. If you're over 40, if you're over 50, if you're over 60, hear me, the older we get, the more we want our comfort zone. But there's a generation, there are families, there are young kids and students and young adults who need the message of Christ like never before. And so, here's what I thought we'd do for fun. I thought we could go down a journey on memory lane and talk about some mountaintop experiences in our church that some of y'all have no idea of. You say, you go to First Step, you hear a little bit about Relevant Church, but I want to give you some snapshots because we have some pretty substantial mountaintop moments in our history. And I get emotional celebrating these, but I want to share a couple thoughts with you after we go through this. So here, Julie and I moved here in 2009. We felt like God was calling us back toward our hometown of Griffin, G Vegas. Any Griffin people in the house? Come on. My staff hates when I say that. Griffin came to first service, apparently. But G Vegas, man, I call it G Vegas because what happens in Griffin stays in Griffin. And so I love, that's my hometown. So we felt like we were supposed to move back and start a church. And she and I moved here with our 2.5-year-old at the time and 3 young adults who were between 18 and 21 years old. They moved with us to help us start a church with no money, no people, no building, no nothing, no nobody, nothing. And we said, you know what? We're going to do everything short of sin to reach people far from God. And so we did stupid stuff. We've done some stupid stuff in our history. We put out yard signs all over town and it said, New Church, Locust Grove, go relevant.com, get involved. And we started having people email us and text us and do all kind of stuff and say, I want to get involved. And we started building a team of people, and we bought some jumpies, some inflatables, and they were old and they were rickety, and they were, man, I'm telling you, it was 100 degrees. And we'd go out and roll these things out in the middle of the summer and do block parties. Like this is the 4th of July here. We did an outreach in a block party in our community. And so just to give you some perspective, that was our first logo over here on that jumpy. And Brandon Kahn told me, he said, if you keep that logo, I'm never coming on staff. And so he made us change that. And then over here on this side, the little kid in the back is now my 13-year-old. Yeah, your parents ever tell you when you were little, the older you get, the faster time goes? Yeah, now the older I get, I'm like, oh my God, nothing truer has ever been stated, except 2020. That took like 10 years. And so we would go out in these community events, and we'd give out free hamburgers and hot dogs, and people would come, and the kids would come and do jumpies. And then we would bake their parents in, right? We would say, hey, kids, there's going to be fireworks tonight. And we got glow sticks. Do you want a glow stick? And they would say, yeah. And we'd say, you can't have one unless your mom and dad comes and fills out a card so we can get all their contact information and bug them later, right? And so this is Julie taking all the information so the kids can get glow sticks. And then we'd follow up, and no less than 6 or 8 families from that neighborhood started attending our church. And I never forget, they would say, where are you going to meet at? And we'd be like, we don't know. You got a building? No. How are you going to pay for it? I don't know. And they would look and literally laugh. And I remember being on the golf course and just riding around with a guy, and I said, he said, how are you going to, can you get a grant for starting a church? I said, I don't know, we got to raise $300,000. And he laughed. He just laughed at me. Now they're part of a church. And he said, that's funny. I just think that's funny. I said, I don't know how, because I didn't know. I just said, we're going to do it. And then finally, July came around, late 2010. We're supposed to start a church. We'd already said, we're going to start a church in October. 10-10-10, October 10th, 2010 was launch day. And I remember we didn't have a facility. And about 6 or 8 weeks before we got ready to move in, to start the church, we found the Locust Grove Conference Center. You can see this here. This is a facility right across the tracks here on I don't remember the name of the street now, right across the tracks. And now it's the Locust Grove, I think it's a senior center for Henry County. And we went in there, and we would have to set that place up every single week and tear it down. And I'm telling you, every Saturday night, there's nothing for us to come in after a wedding, and there'd be alcohol, and people, I mean, it was disgusting, and we'd have to clean it up, all because we said we'll do everything short of sin to reach people far from God. And we'd set it up, we blacked out this facility, and we turned it around. And so we did what we call preview services, which means it was practice. We didn't know what we were doing. And so we would do preview services, and we would set up everything, and we would run through everything with our core team of people. We built a team of 72 people. 72 people. We practiced this, made sure the music and the sound. We had to buy $60,000 worth of equipment. We didn't know what we were doing. And we started blacking everything out. And I don't know how many of y'all can see this picture of the stage pieces over there. Dear God, I'm so glad we're done with that stage. Because it was a pain. We'd set up a stage, set it all up, and then we'd tear it all down every single week. And then I never forget, we built the team to 72 people on the last Sunday before launch. October 3rd, I went to my in-laws' house. We went over there for dinner, for lunch after service. And my father-in-law said, how many people did you have today? And he's a little skeptical. I said, 72. And he said, how many you going to have next week? And I said, we're planning between 250 and 300. He just stopped cold turkey and just stared at me and said, that's a long way from 72. So I threw something at him. And no, I was thinking to myself, you don't, see, it was like he didn't get, so the next week, I never forget being backstage behind the curtains, the pipe and drape that had blocked all the light out from the room. And somebody said, have you looked? I was nervous because I didn't know if anybody was going to show up. Like we put all, it's our life, man. We'd given every dime we had because we were serious about this. And I never forget, somebody came and opened the curtain and said, hey, Carl, have you looked outside? And I said, no. He said, look outside. And cars for days were lined up down the road to get in the building. There's the 3 young adults that moved with us. Now they're married with kids, and they're not all 3 married. They're just... Sorry, when I get emotional, I have to tell jokes. And I'll never forget, we gave donuts away. That's me looking kind of young. And then we packed the place out, and 318 people showed up. And 29 people said yes to Jesus on day 1 of Relevant Church, because we said we're going to do everything short of sin to reach us far from God. I'll never forget, we gave these donuts, Krispy Kreme, y'all, that was back in the day. And we give Krispy Kreme donuts. Now you can't do that because they're Corona donuts. And so my father-in-law came in that day, and he had to give up his seat. So I was like, sucker. And so after service, I saw him. He was such an encouragement to Julie and I as we got moving in the church. I saw him after service, and he had his coffee. And he was diabetic until he wanted sweets. Y'all know those people? He's like, not on Sundays. And he would stack 3 donuts high, the chocolate-covered ones, and he'd be like, I'm not diabetic on Sundays, and it's the Sabbath. I take the Sabbath off for my diabetes, I guess. And he would wear those things out. And I saw him in the lobby, right by the donuts. As everybody's cleaning up, he had to get his last-minute fix in. And he looked at me with tears in his eyes, and he said, good job. And I never forget that moment, because I realized that somehow when we step out in faith and we trust God and we do what He's called us to do, He comes through. And so then the next week comes, right? We call that hangover week. In church planting world, we start churches and you never know. People come, all the well-wishers come for day one. You're like, who's coming back for week 2, right? 216 people showed up. We're like, wow, we lost 33% in 1 week. We dropped all the way down to about 200 people before the trend started back up 4 weeks in. And we tell church planners somewhere in 6 to 8 weeks, you need to see an uptick. You need to see people coming back so you can self-sustain. And then come January of that year, 4 months after we launched, we had outgrown the facility. We needed to launch a second service, but they wouldn't give us the time to do that. I'll never forget, we called in the county and said, can we do this? And they're like, I'm sorry. We would show up on Sundays and they would move a different room because they were renovating it for the senior center there. And so we tell church planners all the time, and I was coached, once you get a facility, don't move if you don't absolutely have to within a year. Because people think you're crazy, you're a lunatic, you're schizo, you don't know what you know. And I didn't realize this. But when we moved here, over the course of 4 years, somewhere around 30 churches had started and closed in our county. And here we are coming here and going, let's do it again. And so in January of that year, we had outgrown it. And I believe it was April 1st of 2011, we moved to Strong Rock Christian School. And it's the gymnasium at Strong Rock. And if you've seen the video, still donuts, by the way. And we revamped that whole facility multiple times and set up, tear down. I mean, it was hours. It's about 150 man hours every single week to set it up and tear it down. Why? Because we will do everything short of sin to reach those far from God. And I remember we started 1 service, and by that fall we were in 2. A year later we were in 3. And then we come toward about 2014 and we're like, we got to do something. We can't keep growing here. We're out of space. And we launched into building what is now our current kids facility. 400-seat auditorium. We could max out at about 600 on campus. And I'll never forget, we began to say, what are we going to do? We kept doing outreach, though. We kept trying to get people in. Here's some pictures of egg drops. Not egg drop soup, like egg drop from the helicopter. And we would drop 100,000 Easter eggs out of the chopper. Y'all got some crazy kids, because these kids would not wait until the eggs. And so they came out running under the helicopter, and then we had to pull the helicopter up, and kids went nuts. And then we kept doing community events, and we partner. I love the city. We did a trunk or treat, and we do special needs outreaches and all kinds of stuff, just loving on kids and loving on our community, because we said, you know what, we want a community to know that a church loves them. And so after pushing forward and continuing to do outreach, continue to love our community, continue to serve, continuing to give, in that same season we launched something called Game Changers, and we said we're going to change the game. We're going to start toward building a new facility, and we took 1.5 years to plan. We bought property, and then we broke ground on this first building that would seat 400 over there. And I'll never forget, we opened the doors. On this particular day, 29 or 30 people took their next step of baptism. To this day, almost 2,000 people have taken their next step of baptism at Relevant Church. Yeah. And so we open this building, and then you start going, uh-oh, who's going to show up? Before we could get a logo on the building, we open it right before Easter, and it was jammed. And we started with 2 services. And then before you knew it, we went to 3. And then 4. And an auditorium that would seat 400, and a kids ministry that would house 200. Some Sundays would be 750 people on campus, turning people away. And about 2,200 people were showing up. And I'll never forget the day that we pulled out the baptismal tubs, and 144 people took their next step over the course of 2 weekends. And then we said, you know what, we got to do something. We can't continue to do this trend. What are we going to do? And so we broke ground on this facility, and here you see some construction pictures. And this building was supposed to open last year, and it was supposed to open, and I thought it would be full. Just going to be honest with you. We expected to move from 2,200. We were turning people away on Sundays, even in certain services, asking them to come back to other services. Never would have dreamed that COVID would strike, and that we needed all this room, and then nobody would come back, right? It's like, God, whoa, this is different, right? But through this process, as a leadership team and as your pastor, and some of you are new to our church, and you're kind of figuring out if this is the church for you. we had to be reminded of something. We had a lot of great mountaintop experiences and a lot of great moments in our history, right? But we have to remember this. Moments are not only reminders of where we come from, but where we are going. And if 5 people turn to 12, turn to 72, turn to 318, turn to 2200, any given week, if we can get to that point with those small group, what can we do if we'll all get serious about changing this community together? If you'll take ownership of loving your neighbor as yourself. If we'll all go in unity, not toward packing out a place. This place will be packed one day, but so that not just 3,400 people can move from death to life and say yes to Jesus, but so that thousands and thousands and 10,000 and 20,000 people over the next decade can move from death to life and begin the journey toward their full potential. What could we do? Because I believe as your pastor, you understand, 1 year ago today was our first virtual experience. And now we're back in a year to the day where we closed the doors on Sundays for a temporary time to just see what was going to happen. Where we're back, and I'm telling you, now's the time where we have to determine whether we're going to turn those mountaintop experiences into monuments or we're going to understand that God has called us to be a movement. We got to decide. Because I've talked to many pastors over the last 3 months, and the constant conversation comes up. The next 3 years in the churches in America are going to be very interesting. I know churches that are closing left and right. I know churches that can't keep the lights on, that people aren't coming back. I thank God that when we decided to come back to in-service in-person experiences, people began to come and serve and make a difference and serve your kids and wear masks and not push back because they understood. We wear a mask so that people far from God can reach their full potential in Jesus Christ. Whether we like it or not, or whether we don't or not, we do it because we'll do everything short of sin to reach those far from God. We don't just do it because of the what, we do it because of a why. And I thank God for the people who came back and you served and you gave. And now we got to determine which type of church we're going to be, because I believe this. There's going to be 2 types of churches in the coming weeks, months, and years. The first one I believe is a self-preserving model. This is a church that's rooted in fear and self. If we can just get all our people back and get our money up and we can just do all this, we'll just come back and we'll just... No. Those churches will lose influence and lose credibility and will never make a kingdom impact. And then there's the church that I will call, for lack of a better term, is self-sacrificing. Self-preserving, self-sacrificing. These are the ones who are rooted in faith and in love. And this was the model of the early church after Jesus left. So Jesus spends 30 years here on earth and then 3.5-ish years with his disciples. And he calls them, these teenage boys, and he says, I'm going to make you fishers of men. I want you to change the world. And so then he dies on a cross. He's resurrected, he appears to them, and then he ascends into heaven. He's like, y'all go change the world. Panic, right? What are we going to do? Panic sets in, fear sets in. What's next? And I love this quote from Dionysius, and he's talking about the Plague of Alexandria. There were 2 plagues that happened some 150 to 200 years after Jesus' death and resurrection. He's talking about the church. He says, the best among them honorably served the sick until they themselves caught the disease and died. What is he talking about? Let me give you a little history here. The Roman Empire moved into self-preservation. Jesus came and upset the political system of the day. And the Roman Empire was scrambling, and now 2 epidemics, pandemics, plagues, whatever you want to call it, seeped into the Roman Empire over the course of several decades. One would have been similar to what we knew today as the measles, the other smallpox, wiping out 1/3 of the Roman Empire, 1/3 of the people. And what the Roman Empire, they went into self-preservation mode. They would push the sick out onto the streets and say, no, you stay isolated, you get away from us, you can't be around us because we're going to self-preserve. But the early church understood what fearless sacrifice meant, and they crushed it in the first 200 years after Jesus' resurrection. In the middle of uncertainty, in the middle of fear, in the middle of whatever, they said, you know what? We are so convinced that Jesus defeated death that we don't have to fear death. That we are so convinced that Jesus gives life that we understand there are plagues and there is sickness, but we don't have to fear those things. And so during the urban plagues, Christians actually didn't flee the cities and they didn't push the lonely away, but they stayed and they cared for the sick and the dying of all groups, not just their own groups. And some of them even got sick and died with the same disease they were caring for those who were sick. You say, what does this mean? Well, I don't know. I never thought in my life we would experience a pandemic. I never thought in my life that we would be going through a year of confusion and chaos like we have. What I know is that we have a great model of what the church should do. And the church can't run in fear and can't hide. I'm not saying we're not wise in the conversation and protecting our brother and sister. That's why we close our doors for a season, and we're managing the process all along. But what about people who are dying and taking their own life because they are suicidal or they're depressed or they're lonely or their anxiety is through the roof? We have a responsibility. And so let's give you a couple recap stories from the Gospels. One is a group of men who've come together and they see a man who's sick. He's paralyzed and they want to get him to Jesus, and the crowds of people are gathered in a home listening to Jesus talk and preach, and they realize, man, Jesus can do something for me. Jesus can do something for me. But there was this, all those people had gathered to self-preserve, but there were 4 men who show an example of self-sacrifice. Let's read this passage in Luke chapter number 5. It says, one day, Jesus was teaching, and the Pharisees and the teacher of the law were sitting there. They had come from every village of Galilee and from Judea and Jerusalem, and the power of the Lord was with Jesus to heal the sick. So all of them are crowded around this man's house listening to Jesus. And it says some men, there were 4 of them, came carrying a paralyzed man on a mat and tried to take him into the house and lay him before Jesus. So we want to help our neighbor. We want to love our neighbor. And we know Jesus has the power to heal. And rather than just coming and getting fed and coming and hearing, we want to bring somebody to the feet of Jesus. But they get there, and it says when they got there, they could not get him to Jesus because the crowd was so big. They went up on the roof and lowered him on his mat through the tiles into the middle of the crowd right in front of Jesus. And Jesus was going to heal him. They climbed that ladder that would have been built on the house of the day. They get up top, and can you imagine being inside and Jesus is teaching, and all of a sudden roof tiles start pulling off. And here comes this random dude floating on a mat. Everybody be like, what in the world? And I can see the guys up top. I'm not sure how it happened. They're not concerned about anything but their neighbor's well-being. I'm going to give you 4 thoughts from this passage. I'm going to read you one more and then give you an illustration. We're going to go home. How should we respond? How do we love our neighbor? What's required of us to love our neighbor as ourselves? Here's the first thing. Compassion. Can I be honest with you? I am not the most compassionate person in the world. Not that surprises you. Why are you laughing, girl? And that's my wife, just so you know. I don't talk to any random woman like that. So I am not, people, man, my kids will come in, Daddy, my 9-year-old Daddy, I'm like, shut up, go back outside. You know, it's like, I'm just not compassionate. And so I don't have a compassionate guy, and some dudes are going, tell them, yeah. I'm just not that guy that's like, oh, baby, let's get some. See, you want to treat it? Let's get some Bactine. You know what Bactine is? That was Grandma's way of saying, if you really hurt, I'm going to hurt you more. Like I'm just not that compassionate. But I've learned something. You actually have to care what people are going through. I used to think, transparency, I used to think counseling was for weak people, for jacked up people, for dysfunctional people. Then I realized I was jacked up and dysfunctional. So now counseling's for everybody, right? What I realized is this: I can't be my own hero. And I realized if there's a brokenness inside of me, there must be brokenness inside of others. And I have to have compassion for what people are going through. Now, it doesn't mean you allow people to play a victim all your life and take advantage of you. Hear me. But we have to actually care. So often we sit back and we criticize, don't we? We blame, we ignore, we just, you know, at some point we got to go, we can't look at the paralyzed man on the mat and go, what'd you do to get there? Right? Well, that's your fault if you wouldn't have done that. No. We actually have to have concern about the well-being of our neighbor. And there were people who were coming to Jesus because he could heal their sickness. Oh man, let's go to the man who teaches and heals. I want to go here. It's where all the crowd is. And 4 men said, no, I'm not worried about that. I know who this man Jesus is to me, and I want my friend, my neighbor, my paralyzed man that I don't know to experience the grace and the love of this God of the universe. And so as believers, if our community is hurting, lonely, overwhelmed, vulnerable, empty for the love, we gotta hurt with them. We got to have compassion. It's not optional. And what's your spirit like during this time? I would tell you that my fear is that through this pandemic, and now that we're kind of trying to figure out how much longer does it look like maybe we're kind of getting out of this. I mean, who knows? My fear is that we will turn so inward and go, well, you know what? Let's just let's just kind of not rock the boat because we don't know what the future, and all of a sudden fear takes over. So no. Compassion has to trump that. Here's the second one. Time. I often wonder, how far did they carry this man? You don't understand, the Middle East is hot. I mean, they're on a mat. I mean, they didn't even have a wheelchair. They carried a dude on a mat. Go home. Put Dad on the mat. Let all the people get on a blanket or whatever. And everybody grab all 4 corners and pick him up and carry him and see how easy it is. You carry him to the front door and be like, you're on your own, son. They carry this guy in the heat. And what did they not do in order to do this? What did they sacrifice? What baseball tournament? What soccer tournament? What cheerleading competition? What fishing? Some of us be like, I'm going to the woods on Sunday. It's hunting season. I love you. Just speaking the truth in love, okay? And so, but you see how, I'm not saying like, oh, perfect church attendance gets you into heaven. What I'm saying, though, is we got to be careful where our priorities lie. So I have a boy, man, he plays travel ball all over the country. There are some stipulations for him to continue playing travel ball. First of all, he better not have a smart mouth, right? Second, he's serving his students. He's here on Tuesdays. He's here on Wednesdays. He's here all throughout the year on Sundays. If he ever is going to miss a Sunday or miss certain times, he better be pouring into his local church. He better be serving. He better be making a difference. Or else his priorities will get jacked. My priorities, our families will, because we got to sacrifice some time and some stuff and some energy to make a difference in other people's lives. Here's number 3. I got to keep going. Planning. You don't just accidentally make a difference. I'll just be honest with you. There are times where you want to be generous, you want to make a difference, but your schedule is too full. You want to give, but your finances are too bankrupt. You want to serve, but oh man, I got this other commitment. We actually have to plan to do something. And so these guys, whatever it took, these guys, okay, how are we going to get this guy? He gets the door and they're like, all right, we got to have a plan. The plan we had ain't working. Here's my fear for the church in America. What we used to do won't work in the future. Let's just gather everybody back. Listen, we ought to gather. The local church ought to gather. People ought to be face to face. It's a New Testament pattern, and we see it all throughout the book of Acts. But at the end of the day, we have to quit acting like, well, if you ain't here, you don't matter. And we got to start thinking creatively. And I'm not saying the church is virtual. I think that's a misnomer as well, because we are meant to be in relationship. But when we get to a crossroads and we're like, man, there's people who need Jesus. How are we going to get them there? We got to be willing to plan and make sacrifices and figure it out. And so I tell you what, now when you get home, take Dad, put him on a blanket, get a ladder, get up on the ladder with Dad, try to get Dad on the roof, see how good that goes. Dad's like, no. It's not like they didn't put the guy on the elevator. They got this paralyzed man on the roof. And so a year ago, we said, okay, we don't know what to do this season. We're going to take some time. We're going to watch. Make sure we protect our community, love our neighbor as ourselves. The whole reason we shut our building was to love our neighbor as ourselves. We tried to gather, and then people disconnected, and virtual church obviously only has so much of an impact. And then we said, you know what? We started regathering because we have to love our neighbors ourselves, because we realized there's a different pandemic. It's not just physical, it's also spiritual and emotional, and it's the mental pandemic that's coming. And so now all along we've been trying to be wise about gathering and social distancing and doing this and trying to figure out, trying to plan as we go along, because things don't always go as planned, do they? And here's the fourth thing we have to have, and I told you about this last week. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. So many of you get this and you're generous, but it takes resources, right? I never forget when we started Relevant. They was like, how are you going to do it? I don't know. We just have to trust God with the process. And obviously, we had to have people believe in the mission. You ever ask yourself in this situation, I know if this is my house, I don't know the whole owner of the house situation, but I'm like, who's going to fix that roof? You just put a hole in. Imagine somebody just rolling up and then just cut a hole. Who fixed the roof? It just leaves the roof open in the Bible. It's just like the roof stuff's like, now we have a dome. Now we're retractable. I don't know how that works. But the roof is open. You know what I do know? You know who I don't know who fixed the roof, but I know who didn't fix the roof. The casual, apathetic, critical, lazy, church goer, sitter on the pewer, church hopper. Listen, if you've been in 5 churches in 3 years, there's a problem, and you are it. If you can't with that church, find somewhere you can settle down and invest your life for the cause of Christ. Who fixed the roof? I don't know, but somebody had to. And I think as we move forward, we got to understand there are so many things that we have to do, and it takes all of us to do our part. And so Jesus modeled this in his early ministry. Jesus showed us. I wonder why his disciples got this premise, and I wonder why the New Testament church boomed like it did, is because Jesus showed us why and how your neighbor matters. In Matthew chapter 5, 6, 7, we see Sermon on the Mount. This is Jesus' longest message on a mountain. It's the longest recorded message we have, and he's teaching these people for hours, days. We don't know how long it is exactly. But crowds just continue. Man, he's teaching. They're up the mountain. They're going up the mountain. Now, there's somebody at the bottom of the mountain. They're just passing. They're going up the mountain, and Jesus is teaching them how to unlearn some religious ways of thinking. He says, you have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye. And he says, but I tell you, turn the other cheek. You have heard, love your neighbor. I tell you, love your enemies. I mean, he's going through, he's like, all these religious systems that you've been doing, I'm telling you, the greater grace, the greater calling is not to check religious boxes, but to love your neighbor as yourself. And people are like, wow, this man's awesome. And crowds and crowds and crowds are coming up on a mountain to hear him preach because he could cast his voice over the mountain. People could hear. It's like being in the mountains and a sunset and just looking out and going, man, this is amazing. But Jesus had to come off the mountain. We see this all throughout the scriptures. And the Bible says that when he came off the mountain, listen to what happens. This large crowd followed Jesus as he came down the mountainside. Suddenly a man with leprosy approached him and knelt before him. Leprosy was known as the disease of that day that was unclean. And if somebody saw a man with leprosy or a woman with leprosy, it was like, what did they do? What sin did they commit? They are unclean, and they would be isolated and pushed out into isolation by themselves, away from humanity. They would just be left to die. Loneliness, overwhelmed, vulnerable, empty, no hope. And you never touch a leper. Because if you touch the leper, leprosy would now infect you, and you would become a leper. Now you would be isolated and pushed aside and left for dead. And Jesus comes down the mountain, and the leper starts to, can you imagine the crowds? Oh. And the man said, if you are willing, you can heal me and make me clean. Listen, all throughout history to that day, anytime something unclean touched something clean, the unclean made the clean unclean. That's what they believe. It's a religious model today. So if leprosy touched you, you became a leper. If unclean touched clean, you became unclean. And it says Jesus reached out and touched him. And he said, be healed. Instantly the leprosy disappeared. Listen to me. for the first time in history, something that was clean touched something unclean, and the unclean became clean. That's symbolic of what Jesus did, living a sinless life, taking your sins upon his back, being put in a tomb and resurrected so that you in your uncleanness, my uncleanness called sin, could have new life in him. I just wonder why the church has missed it so much. I think that we get caught up. You guys have crazy people in your family that you invite to Thanksgiving? Anybody? They don't know how to act, right? And so I don't know about you, but like, I don't like going to stiff dinners, right? Where everything's just all proper and we've got to get it all together. Anybody ever been to Lambert's? Y'all ever been to Lambert's? If you've never been to Lambert's, here's what happens. Lambert's, bro, they don't care. They come out and they say, hot rolls. You raise your hand and it's like, I knew you'd catch it. See, I knew you would. I knew you would. They'll just bring it out on like a tire tray. I mean, it's huge. And then just like eat. And it's NFL. And you're throwing stuff. Like, that's my kind of part. That's how I want to eat. All this stiff, proper stuff. I can't do it. But then there's people who, you know how it is. You have people come and they don't know how to act at the table. You teach your kids manners, they don't know how to act. And so you got all this stuff and you got this plan, and what happens when somebody comes? You ever seen anybody double dip? Y'all gross. They come to the table and we sit down to eat. There's always that one person who don't really have any manners. Y'all know who I'm talking? Don't point at them. They're slicking their fingers and touching stuff, and you're like, I wonder what happens. I think this is what happens in the church. Is for so long we've said, hey, we want you to come to the table. We want you to eat with us. I know you're not maybe part of the spiritual family. We want to invite you. But we want to invite you to the table. And then people who aren't believers or who don't have a relationship with God or they got a lot of junk, they don't know how to act. So they come to the table and they're just hungry. They don't know how you're supposed to behave, so they just want to eat. And they see that there's something that they've been longing for and wanting their whole life. And now they're getting something they have never had. And so they thought just eating. And you know what I worry about? I worry that when they do this, they don't know how people are going to respond. They already feel insecure. You ever heard anybody say, I don't go to church because if I go to church, the building going to burn down. Y'all ever heard somebody say that? They already feel like they don't have a place, and then when they come in, they don't really know what they're supposed to do. I had somebody say one time to me, why y'all wear jeans in church? So we could wear nothing? He said, well, Jesus, do you know that scripture where Jesus said Jesus healed that man and then he sat down by the fire with his church clothes on? What translation are you reading, bro? Because the passage you're referring to, first of all, it doesn't say that. And second of all, it was before Jesus had died and resurrected, so the church didn't even exist. So there wasn't no such thing as church clothes. Do you see how, if we're not careful, the person who doesn't know how to act, they don't feel comfortable at the table? And here's my pressing on our church. We have two options. Oh, They come in, let me get you a napkin, let me help you. Come on, let me get you cleaned up because you got to know how to act. And so we work so hard to get them looking right and smelling right and all cleaned up because we know you got to, but before you see, churches have done this for years, haven't they? What if we just stopped and instead of worrying about getting them all cleaned up, we just got up from the table and we began to serve. What can I get you? What do you need? For the love of God, can we just let them eat? They're spiritually hungry. They're undernourished. And we have the greatest gift on the planet, and that is a relationship with Jesus. And we're too worried about everybody getting it all together and making it right. And the church has become an uncomfortable place for too many people. Because we're more worried about what we're doing after. We're more worried about our politics. We're more worried about what people think. Can we just let people eat? And can we tell them there's something that's been prepared for you? So I don't know about you. Like, I don't just give away money on the streets when somebody comes and says, hey, I'm hungry, right? No, but if I see somebody hungry on the streets, what I'll do is say, hey, come on, let's go into the convenience store. Let's go into the restaurant. Let me buy you some food. I don't want people to go hungry. True story, we were in Charleston about several months back, and we were celebrating our 20-year anniversary, and took Julie out to dinner, and then we came out, we went to dinner and then dessert, and so we had spent all this money on ourselves. And I come out, and there's a guy who's like, hey, man, can I have some money? I'm hungry. Well, I just spent all this money on myself. What do you say, right? You do the right thing, and you said, sure, let me get you something to eat. And he said, he already had his list of what he wanted. Why don't you go right down there? Why don't you just give me that combo, that wing combo, and it comes with fries and then extra ketchup and extra ranch. He knew. And so I was like, all right. I went down there. I thought it was going to be like $10 or $12. Like $27. I'm like, what kind of, you, the whole, what are these, like pterodactyl wings or what? I don't want my boy to go hungry. But how many times do we walk by people that are spiritually starving? They don't know. I promise I'm almost done, kids ministry. 1 Corinthians chapter 9, Paul says, though I am free and belong to no one, I've made myself a slave to everyone to win as many as possible. To the Jew, he says, I became like a Jew to win the Jews. In other words, I'm a Jew, but I'm free from their religious system, but I understand their religious system, so I'd become, and I'd talk to them in their language. To those under the law, I'll become like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law. In other words, I'm not about the religious system, but I know the law enough to have a conversation. To those, he says, as to win those as to win those not having the law. To the weak, I became weak. To win the weak, I have become all things to all people so that I, by all possible means, might save some. To the religious, I talked the religious language. To those that weren't religious and far from God, I understood what they were going through. I learned. And he says, I do all this for the sake of the gospel, that I may share in its blessings. Okay? Now, I'm going to end with this statement, and then we're going to pray. At Relevant Church, as long as I'm your pastor, we will always make room for people at the table. If we got to do 47 services on a Sunday, we'll do 47 services on a Sunday. But we will do everything short of sin to reach those far from God, because Christ did everything short of sin to reach us. Okay? Some of y'all are already like, well, it's already 10 minutes past. You don't get it. Okay? You just gave up 10 minutes of your Sunday and you're already mad. Hear me. We won't stop. We are never finished. And so I want you to close your eyes. I want to pray for you. Maybe you're here today and you say, Carl, I'm not a follower of Jesus, but today I want to put my trust and my faith in him. I'm one of those people you talked about. I don't really know how this church thing works. I don't really understand the grace of God, but today I know I'm empty and I'm hungry for something different and something real, and I want to put my trust and faith in Jesus. I want him to forgive me of my sins, be Lord of my life, and I want to follow him from this day forward with nobody looking around. Maybe you're watching online. You can let us know in the comments or the chat or a private message, but you would say, Carl, I want to move from death to life. I want to follow Jesus. When I say 3, would you lift your hands all across this room? Hands are going up already. Come on, 1, 2, 3. Wow, look at them. Oh my gosh. Come on, lift them up high. Let us know if you're online. Come on, I want to pray for you right now as well. If you lifted your hand, would you whisper these words to God? The Bible says if you believe in your heart and confess with your mouth, Jesus died on the cross, God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. You'll be given a new life. And now we start on a new journey toward our full potential. If you lifted your hand, whisper these words. Dear God, I come to you right now. I believe Jesus lived a sinless life, died on the cross for my sins so that I could have new life. I pray you'd forgive me of my sins, that you'd be Lord of my life, that you'd help me to live for you from this day forward. Today, thank you for saving me. I call you my Savior, and I call you my Lord. I want to live for you in Jesus' name. And everybody said, amen. Come on, church, at least a dozen hands. Come on, don't you do it lightly. This is what it's all about. Wow.